On Saturday, December 6, 1941, a Lockheed Hudson bomber from the Royal Australian Air Force was flying northwest over the China Sea into the Gulf of Thailand, while conducting a reconnaissance mission from Khota Bahru on the west coast of Malaya. The crew of the Hudson saw 3 transports steaming in the same direction as a Japanese cruiser around 12:12 p.m., close to the end of its range. A larger convoy of 18 transports, including cruisers and destroyers, was sighted 30 minutes after the initial sighting to the south. To get a better look, Flight Lieutenant John C. Ramshaw brought his plane down. No shots were fired by the Japanese. Khota Bahru was alerted to the sighting by the Hudson. The Commander-in-Chief, Far East, Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham, could not have been more pleased by the sighting reports and the discovery of a second Hudson that confirmed the first. In 1940, he was assigned to the leadership. He was tasked with trying to prevent conflict with Japan. As anticipated, the Japanese intended to seize Malaya and Singapore in order to avoid any danger to shipments of essential oil supplies from the Netherlands East Indies. By seizing Singapore, the naval and commercial emblem of Britain's dominion in the Far East, the Japanese also sought to undermine British reputation. General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Imperial Japanese Army was assigned 5 months to capture Malaya and Singapore. He commanded 3 divisions, totaling 62,000 soldiers, 183 guns, and 228 tanks. The 5th, Lieutenant General Takuro Matsui, the 18th, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, and the Imperial Guards, Lieutenant General Takuma Nishimura. With 168 fighters, 180 bombers, and 45 reconnaissance aircraft, the 3rd Air Division was a part of the 25th Army. The convoys were to be protected by the Southern Expeditionary Fleet, which included 148 aircraft and the 22nd Air Flotilla. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's Imperial Navy had the plan, but the Army and Navy had a savage disagreement over tactics, with the Army believing that no southward movement should occur until China had been subjugated. The Navy sought the Emperor's consent for its proposal, as well as the Dutch oil fields. In order to protect Japanese communication routes to Burma and Malaya, the initial objective was to seize Bangkok, the capital of Thailand. Political factors, not good military reasoning, were the basis of British policy in the area. To guard the air bases, the Army traveled to Malaya. The Singapore Island Naval Base was guarded by the Air Force. The idea was that the Royal Navy could be there in force in 48 days and would have the authority to prevent any invasion at dangerous times. Because their 15-inch coastal defense guns at Singapore looked out to sea and could not be moved to fire at a threat from the north, the British had also not even taken into account the potential of a land attack from the dense forests to the north. Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, had even pridefully said in 1940 that any attempt by Japan to seize Singapore would be a mad enterprise. Through its signals, intelligence, SIGINT, which was based on intercepts of Japanese telegraphic messages, British intelligence was undoubtedly well aware of Japan's military strategy by the middle of 1940. The 2 men who were primarily in charge of cracking Japanese naval codes in the years preceding World War I were Scott Hugh Foss and Commander Eric Nave of the Royal Australian Navy's cryptography team. Through spies on the ground, Japanese intelligence was also aware of Singapore's weak fortifications. The German surface raider Atlantis captured and sank the British cargo ship Automedon in 1940, delivering documents to the Japanese that contained classified British reports. The minutes of the August 15, 1940, British War Cabinet meeting were among the reports that were taken. It described the Far East policy, which included defending Malaya and showed that Singapore could not be strengthened while Hong Kong and Borneo were unprotected. In addition, if Japan attacked Thailand, Britain would not go to war. But by 1941, the Royal Navy had limited resources to spare in the case of Japanese attack in or near Malaya due to its heavy commitments in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Nevertheless, in 1941, the Admiralty began planning the Eastern Fleet, Britain's 3rd Fleet, which would include 7 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, and a large number of cruisers and destroyers. But the capital ships chosen were slow or ancient. such as the battleships Nelson and Rodney, the elderly battlecruisers Renown and Repulse, and other well-worn vessels. The Royal Navy was running out of time. Many of the ships needed to be refurbished and equipped with the newest radar technology. The main disadvantage was the lack of destroyers, which were either used for convoy missions or were entirely devoted to the Mediterranean and home fleets. The plan's implementation was delayed until an optimistic March 1942. Winston Churchill had expressed to the First Sea Lord his belief that a powerful force ought to be dispatched to the Indian Ocean when he became Prime Minister. The most cost-effective course of action would be to dispatch the Duke of York to the east, via Trinidad and Simonstown, as soon as she is free of construction flaws. Repulse or Renown and one fast-moving aircraft carrier might join her. The triangle of Aden, Singapore, and Simonstown could be the manifestation of this potent energy. It would cause Japanese naval activity to become paralyzed. When it eventually set sail for Cape Town, it was the brand-new battleship Prince of Wales, which had been put into service in January 1941. At Ceylon, she later joined the elderly battlecruiser Repulse. On November 11, 1941, both ships reached Singapore. The new aircraft carrier, HMS Indomitable, which operates in the West Indies, was supposed to become a part of the tiny fleet. Nevertheless, Indomitable damaged her hull when she ran aground on a reef off Bermuda on November 3rd and was sent to Norfolk, Virginia for repairs. She was gone in 12 days because the U.S. Navy dockyard operated quickly. By the time she arrived at the Indian Ocean, however, it was too late. Repulse, who was assigned Force Z, and the Prince of Wales had already been decided. On December 10th, Japanese planes sank the two battleships. To protect Singapore and Malaya, the Royal Air Force used 158 aircraft, some of which were outdated. An adequate defense had been projected to require about 550 first-line aircraft. With 88 600 soldiers, the Army's three corps included the 8th Australian Division, which included the Singapore Fortress troops and a reserve brigade, as well as the 11th and 9th Indian Divisions. Operation Matador was a preemptive operation that the British had prepared to confront the Japanese directly in southern Thailand. The idea was sound. It only needed a 24-hour notice of a Japanese landing to be effective. In addition to having the warning, Brooke Popham was no longer required to request approval from the War Cabinet before placing the order for Matador. The United States promised Britain support in the event of war with Japan on December 1st. It was contingent upon a Japanese attack on British territory, though. "They have held you personally accountable for declaring war on Japan," noted General Ian S.O. Playfair, the Chief of Staff at Brooke Popham. One of Matador's plans was to occupy Patani and Singora in Thailand. However, this was not feasible because of a lack of troops. The major force, the 11th Indian Division, which is located in Khota, was reorganized to move as far north as Singora, which is 130 miles north of the Malayan border. From the border town of Kra, a smaller force from the Penang garrison would drive along the Patani Road. The ledge, located 35 miles across the Thai side of the border, was its target. This route was easily obstructed because it was carved into the sheer edge of a hill. According to the plan, the Japanese would be halted at Singora, permitted to land at Patani, and finally surrounded at Kra. The Japanese could make amphibious landings on a number of beaches in eastern Malaya. The four most likely were Kuantan, Endau, Mersing, which was much further south and defended by the Australians, and Khota Bahru, which was guarded by the 8th Indian Brigade. Only the most severe weather would prevent the Japanese from landing, even if the northeast monsoon might whip up the waters at that time of year. At Jitra, very close to the Thai border, permanent defenses had been erected to protect the airfields, but not the actual boundary. They were not even complete. In order to resolve certain issues with General Sir Lewis Heath, the commander of the 3 Indian Corps, who opposed Operation Matador, General Arthur Percival, the commander of Commonwealth forces in Malaya, flew north on December 6th. When Percival got back to Singapore that night, he discovered that Brooke Popham had not turned on Matador. The commander-in-chief was undecided, despite the overwhelming evidence of a Japanese invasion. A consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat was unable to find the German fleet on the afternoon of December 6th. 80 miles south of Cape Cambodia, another Catalina discovered the Japanese convoy heading west toward Thailand. Hudson bombers were unable to locate the convoy because of low visibility, and the convoy's air cover shot down the Catalina before it could report the sighting. Matador waited. 30 critical hours had elapsed since the initial sightings. Another Hudson saw the convoy at 5:50 p.m., was fired upon, but sent a radio signal. The convoy was cruising south toward Patani and Khota Bahru, 70 miles north of Singora. Brooke Popham continued to hesitate. At 9 p.m. on the 6th, he met Percival in the war room at the Singapore Island Naval Base. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, Force Z commander, joined them at 10:30 p.m. Finally, a choice was made. On December 8th, Matador would be activated at sunrise, but then it would be too late. On Sunday, December 7th, just after midnight, Mutaguchi's 18th Division started landing at Khota Bahru, where the 317 Dogra Regiment was protecting the beaches. A mile and a half inland, the 3rd Air Division started bombing and strafing the airfield. The Japanese had 26,000 men ashore a few hours later. The 5th Division, meanwhile, touched down in Thailand at Patani and Singora. As Japanese landing craft proceeded to disgorge their troops, Indian troops at posts 13 and 14 of the 317 Dogra Regiment reported at dawn on December 7th that they were on the verge of being overrun. In response, Japanese vessels fired back against British 18-pounder guns. Machine gun fire killed many of the first wave of attacking troops. The defenders were attacked from behind by some of the landing craft that entered the stream between the Bandang and Sabak beaches. After fierce hand-to-hand combat, the Japanese troops swept the beaches by 1 p.m. With varying degrees of effectiveness, the Australian Hudsons from Khota Bahru Airport assaulted the Japanese cargo off the beaches. One was destroyed, another was bombed and abandoned, exploding into flames. As Hudsons bombed and strafed the damaged ships, Japanese men jumped over their sides or clambered into landing craft. Anti-aircraft fire brought down 2 Hudsons. General Heath found his predicament hard to believe. All night long, his 3 Indian Corps would have to wait for the order to enter Thailand. On December 8th, just after midnight, he called Singapore and informed Percival that the Japanese had landed at Khota Bahru, waking him from his sleep. Admiral Phillips was still in Manila, where he had discussed joint action with the United States with American Admiral Thomas C. Hart, Asiatic Fleet. Thinking that if an invasion was underway, he might be able to halt it before the Japanese had a foothold, he proposed at the War Room Conference that he take his ships to sea and move north. He presented his idea to the attendees and requested fighter cover from land. An air raid warning interrupted the meeting, but Air Vice Marshal Conway Pulford pointed out that his fighter pilots would attempt to support Force Z despite their limitations and lack of experience in the naval support role. Japanese aircraft struck Singapore at 4:30 a.m. I rate the chances of getting there no higher than 50-50, but I'm sure it's the only way in which to halt the invasion, and if it can be halted, they should find it impossible to start again, Phillips said, gesturing to the Admiralty at 6 a.m. on December 8th that he was directing Force Z to sea toward Khota Bahru. Although surprise is crucial, it is only feasible in this heavy monsoon season with even mediocre luck, but we will be assaulted if we are spotted, which will inevitably happen eventually. Finally, at his headquarters in Kuala Lumpur, Percival told General Heath that the Japanese had already reached Singora and Patani and instructed him to send a mobile force across the border to stall the enemy's advance. Then, at 10 in the morning, Heath's headquarters received a telegram canceling Matador. I find it impossible to excuse General Percival for permitting Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham not to arrive at a decision on 7th of December, when everything pointed to the certainty of Japan initiating the war in Malaya, Heath wrote after the war. The Japanese were the only ones who benefited from the awful confusion. General Yamashita's 25th Army troops were swarming the beaches at Khota Bahru 70 minutes before to the Imperial Japanese Navy's planes attacking Pearl Harbor. About 150 aircraft from the 7th Japanese Air Brigade, which was originally based in southern Indochina, attacked the 7 RAF airfields in northern Malaya until December 8th. At these stations, Pulford had begun the day with 110 aircraft. He had to pull the remaining planes south at the end, since he had half that number. 40 had been destroyed and 20 damaged. In one day, the Japanese had achieved air superiority. The Japanese 5th Division quickly overran Singora and Patani, dismissing the Thai Army's weak opposition. Before long, the Japanese had 60 planes flying out of Singora airfield and more than 100 in Bangkok, further north. 2 of his battalions were instructed to counterattack the Japanese on the beaches at Khota Bahru by Brigadier Berthold Key, commander of the Indian 9th Division's 8th Brigade. However, Key's forces were unable to halt Japanese attempts to seize the airfield as the attack swiftly collapsed in a torrential monsoon downpour. Despite Pulford's order to send the planes further south to Kuantan, the airstrip collapsed after midnight due to the Indian forces' frantic resistance. Japanese ships returned to the beaches about 7 p.m., dropping off additional men. Key was forced to retreat to the town of Khota Bahru. His troops tried to flee in the flood, with many being lost. Others did not receive the order and stayed in their trenches to be destroyed. The RAF and the 9th and 11th Indian Divisions were already seriously weakened by Brooke Popham's hesitancy. The defense of the naval base in Singapore and the safety of convoys transporting reinforcements and supplies were now primarily the responsibility of Pulford's Air Force. This brought to light the British strategy's flaws. Half of Percival's infantry battalions in northern Malaya were dedicated to the Army's deployment to guard the airfields. Rather, they need to have been dug in with robust mobile forces supporting them along the main southward roads. It could have been feasible to move troops as needed if there had been sufficient transportation and well-trained soldiers, but this would have been very challenging. The Australian destroyer Vampire escorted Force Z out of Singapore at 5:10 p.m. on December 8th. The destroyers Tenedos, Repulse, Prince of Wales, and 2 further destroyers, Electra and Express, followed her. On a beautiful evening, people gathered along the shore to wave the ships away as they passed through the Johore Strait. The sight must have cheered the onlookers. On board the ships, some people lacked confidence. We had left Singapore in beautiful weather, but I had this premonition that the Prince of Wales would never return to Singapore or any other port, wrote Seaman W.S. Searle of the Prince of Wales. He was correct when he said, "I felt like this was the end for the ship." When messages from Rear Admiral Arthur Palliser in Singapore arrived, Admiral Phillips was just as worried as Seaman Searle. Beginning at 8 a.m. on December 9th, the RAF would conduct reconnaissance, but only with 1 Catalina and within a 100-mile radius to the northwest. Even worse, the military situation at Khota Bahru does not seem good, and Japanese have large bomber forces based in southern Indochina and possibly in Thailand. Additionally, fighter protection on Wednesday 10th will not be possible. Despite being extensively involved in the land battle in northern Malaya, the RAF had not completely deserted the Navy. Supporting Force Z was the mission assigned to number 453 Australian Squadron, which was equipped with Brewster Buffalo aircraft at Sembawang Airport on Singapore Island. The Japanese submarine I-65 saw Force Z at 1:30 p.m. on December 9th. Up until 3:50, when the ships went into a squall and contact was lost, the submarine was able to maintain visual contact. Around 6 p.m., the submarine was able to make contact again, but it had to dive due to an oncoming aircraft. The ships were nowhere to be seen when I-65 surfaced. 2 hours had passed between the initial sighting and the signals from I-65 being received. The Japanese Navy was shocked to discover the British ships moving toward Khota Bahru, since they believed they were still in Singapore. About 120 miles from the British ship's estimated location, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa of the cruiser Chokai gave the order for all nearby Japanese warships to conduct a search for the British during the remaining daylight hours. To help in the search, a number of Ozawa's cruisers launched their seaplanes. 3 aircraft, seaplanes from the Japanese cruisers, were detected by the Prince of Wales's radar approximately an hour before sunset. They plotted Force Z's course and speed while staying out of anti-aircraft range, and they informed Admiral Ozawa of their findings. Admiral Phillips was aware of the sighting of Force Z by 8:15. Have most regretfully canceled the operation because, having been located by aircraft, surprise was lost, and our target would be almost certain to be gone by the morning and the enemy fully prepared for us, the Prince of Wales said, gesturing to Repulse at 8:55. Singapore was the destination of Force Z's return. Admiral Palliser, however, indicated soon before midnight that the enemy had reported landing Kuantan, 0.350 north latitude. Phillips knew full well that Malaya would be split in two if the Japanese took control of the route that ran inland from Kuantan. He accelerated his ships to 25 knots and turned them toward Kuantan. He did not break radio silence to tell Singapore of his change of mind, because he was eager to surprise the enemy and feared that doing so might give the enemy information about his position. No. 453 Squadron was on standby to support Force Z, and Phillips apparently thought Palliser would set up air cover for the morning of the 10th. However, nothing was done. The Kuantan report was a false alarm, and RAF HQ in Singapore was unaware of Force Z's location. After attempting an unsuccessful torpedo strike, the Japanese submarine I-58 detected the British ships at midnight while sailing south and shadowed on the surface, transmitting multiple signals. The Japanese 22nd Air Flotilla in French Indochina was informed of Force Z's location. On December 9th, it made an unsuccessful search for the British ships. The Japanese launched 30 aircraft and 50 torpedo bombers at 6 a.m. on the 10th. They flew nearly as far south as Singapore, 150 miles beyond Kuantan, but saw nothing. On the way back, though, a cloud break showed the British ships. Around 11 a.m., the torpedo bombers arrived after the high-level bombers. The Japanese aircraft had been detected by the British ship's radar. Repulse and Prince of Wales were bombed in the initial attack, and the flagship was then struck by a torpedo. Following the combat, Repulse Captain Bill Tennant reported, "The Prince of Wales shared the second attack, which was carried out by torpedo bomber aircraft. Although I am not ready to disclose the exact number of machines involved in this attack, I believe that we were successful in examining the tracks of a significant number of torpedoes, possibly as many as 12. At the moment, we were steaming at 25 knots. I stayed on course until the wheel was put over and the attacks providentially combed when the aircraft seemed committed to the attack. We were fortunate to avoid all of these torpedoes, in large part because of the excellent work that all of the bridge staff did at this time in calmly pointing out oncoming aircraft that were launching torpedo bombs. I would like to document this work." Repulse attempted to assist Prince of Wales, but was struck by a bomb once more before being struck by 4 more torpedoes. Repulse was hit 5 times after evading 19 torpedoes. At 12:33, she rolled over. On board Repulse, Royal Marine Sergeant H.A. Nunn remembered, "I kicked off my shoes and climbed over the guard rail because it was time for me to go over the side. Despite the rips and tears to my person and clothes, I had to spend the remainder of the trip in my seat, even though I could walk part of the way down the ship's side. I was a great swimmer, so even though I had my life belt on, I didn't hesitate to get in the water. The idea that there might be sharks around didn't even occur to me. My sole worry was trying to escape the ship and the oily patch that was starting to appear on the water's surface." Of the 1309 men in the crew, including Captain Tennant and Sergeant Nunn, 796 were saved from Repulse. To remove men off the injured Prince of Wales, the Destroyer Express arrived. Lieutenant W.M. Graham recalls that the Prince of Wales passed out while he was still alive. "I can still clearly recall walking over the bilge keel, keeping up with the roll, and thinking as I swam away how clean the ship's bottom looked. I was able to muster the most of my close-range gun crews over on the starboard side. I last saw the Prince of Wales's underbelly in 1939, when I witnessed her being launched at Camel Laird's Yard in Birkenhead, Liverpool." The Prince of Wales was brought down just as the Buffaloes of No. 453 Squadron arrived. Tom Viggers, a flight lieutenant, remembered seeing the survivors waving at him from the greasy water. "I saw a lot of men in grave danger cheering, joking, and waving at a low-flying airplane like they were vacationers at Brighton. Something above human nature was present, and it shook me. I removed my hat in their honor because I observed the energy that prevails in battle in them. I do not remember any naval blow so heavy or so painful in my whole experience as the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, said Winston Churchill. The notion of Japanese invincibility was strengthened by the loss of the British vessels, which greatly enhanced Japanese reputation. After celebrating the news in Berlin, Adolf Hitler made the deadly error of declaring war on the United States. The British Army was now mostly alone in Malaya. In an attempt to bridge the Perak River, General Matsui's 5th Division began its southward movement from Singora and Patani on December 8th. To stop this action, the British launched Operation Crowcall, but the road cut into the hillside above the Patani River, and the British had to win the race to the ledge. Assigned to this position, Major General David Murray Lyon's force had a rough start and failed to reach the start line on December 8th. The 316 Punjabis, however, were present and independently advanced into Thailand without the aid of artillery. They quickly encountered difficulties with the Thais, who had been instructed to protect their nation from the British in order to avoid inciting the Japanese. Because they were not informed that the Japanese had invaded, the Thai police were setting up barricades, which caused the British advance to be delayed. The Japanese 42nd Regiment, aided by tanks, quickly opened fire on the Punjabis after they had beaten them to within 6 miles of the ledge the following day. The 316 sustained significant casualties and was forced to retreat. Along the Singora-Jitra road, another British force, this time equipped with artillery and mechanized, came into contact with a Japanese column as it pushed into Thailand from Khota. After the British gunners stopped the column, Japanese forces quickly outflanked the position and flooded into the jungle, driving the British back. They then demolished bridges before rejoining the 11th Indian Division at Jitra. Instead of focusing on the 2 main roads that led into Jitra from the north, Murray Lyon dispersed his men too widely over a 12-mile front from Jitra to the sea, and the Jitra line was neither strong nor based on natural features. A chart displaying the British defenses at Jitra had been taken by the Japanese. Despite their careless attack, the tanks managed to get past the ill-prepared lines. 3,000 Indian forces surrendered when the Japanese broke through in 15 hours. Massive quantities of supplies were taken, including enough food and munitions to sustain the Japanese for months. Along well-maintained roads, the Japanese poured into northern Malaya, with the army riding bicycles at high speed. The 18th Division captured Khota Bahru on the east coast. Murray Lyon asked to retreat to Gurum, 30 miles to the south, but was turned down. But as the Japanese advance from Crow threatened to cut him off, he reiterated the appeal. His weary, rain-soaked, and generally bewildered men trekked south on December 13th. The 11th Indian Division was in danger of disintegrating at Gurum, and the headquarters of the 6th Brigade was destroyed. They kept losing men as they retreated past the Muda River. By December 20th, they had moved closer to Taipong in the south, leaving Penang undefended. There was no air cover for the British. The Japanese Zero fighters were too strong for the antiquated buffaloes. 3 companies of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders were moved forward from Crow to Bailing, on the main road, by Brigadier Archie Paris's reserve 12th Brigade, while C Company, equipped with armored cars, proceeded to Greek in case the Japanese exploited that mountain track. Because of their commanding officer, Lieutenant Cole Ian Stewart, the Argylls were one of the few British infantry battalions that had received extensive jungle training. Stewart kept his soldiers square bashing, which many desk-bound soldiers believed to be barking mad. Stewart developed swift tiger patrols that were intended to encircle enemy soldiers and force them into artillery, mortar, and armored vehicle roadblocks. He was now going to try his strategies. The Japanese suffered a severe defeat in the first battle, but the Argylls were forced back by the weight of the numbers. Company C conducted a combat withdrawal along 150 miles of the Greek Road after briefly holding back the 42nd Japanese Infantry Regiment before having to retreat to Sumpatan. The Argylls fought at Sumpatan, Lengong, and Kota Tampon alongside the 5-2 Punjabis. Captain Kenneth MacLeod thanked the 2-3 Australian Motor Transport Company for their assistance. They were constantly ready to receive our troops at the waiting areas. They would occasionally pick up a rifle and attempt to shoot the adversary. They were wonderful men. When Lieutenant General Sir Henry Pownall arrived in Singapore on December 23rd to succeed Brooke Popham as commander, he immediately began examining the Western Front's battlefields. The British were superior in artillery, and he wanted to retain the Japanese at Kampar, a hill position that provided range. "The 11th Division has had a pretty good shaking up," he wrote. "They took a while, far too long, to recover after being flung onto the wrong leg. I believe that Heath is doing fine. Since I knew him in India, he has grown significantly. Although he isn't full of fire, he is aware of how to get the troops to turn around." Pownall expressed his displeasure with Percival in his diary, writing that he hoped he wouldn't have to relieve him because he felt gloomy and uninspired. While the 12th and 28th Brigades engaged in delaying activities to the north, the combined remnants of the 6th and 15th Brigades were to dig in at Kampar. Murray Lyon, the commander of the 11th Division, and all three of his brigade commanders had been removed. Murray Lyon's temporary replacement, Archibald Paris, dispatched his own 12th Brigade south of Ipoh on the evening of December 27th of 28. While the 12th Brigade halted the Japanese advance and withdrew via Kampar to Baidoor, the 28th Brigade was to join the defenders at Kampar. The Argylls' armored vehicles saved them by securing the bridge across the Kampar River and permitting the Japanese to cross, but they were mainly unsuccessful in delaying them. The 12th Brigade had lost 500 men and the majority of its vehicles by the time it arrived at the reserve position. The 18th British Division and 50 Hurricane fighters and pilots were on the way, and the British commanders knew it well. Holding the Japanese as far north as possible was essential to prevent their planes from flying over Singapore, but the convoy was not anticipated to arrive until January 13th and 15. The Japanese began probing the positions at Kampar on December 31st. The main attack occurred the following day, and the 48-hour battle was harsh. Then the 15th and 6th Brigades began to retreat. However, the Japanese had outflanked the position by sea, so this withdrawal was not prompted by the attack at Kampar. Through Taloq Anson, they had across the Perak River in a fleet of small boats. Brigadier Paris sent the weaker 12th Brigade from Bidor to stall the Germans after learning of the invasion. The Japanese 4th Guards were first held at Taloq Anson by the Argylls and 19th Hyderabad Regiment. The Argylls took the brunt of the attack, and the fighting was intense. The favorable position at Kampar was lost when the 12th Brigade was unable to maintain the road south, and the 11th Division moved to a less advantageous position on the Slim River. The 28th Brigade covered the line eastward along the road to the Slim River Bridge, while the 12th Brigade occupied a section of the road between Song Khao and Trolak. The nation did not favor field artillery, and the majority of battalions lacked anti-tank fortifications and were reduced to company level. After the 12th Brigade had been extensively bombarded, the Japanese launched an attack down the railway line on January 5th. After being flung back at first, they advanced the following day with the help of tanks and the railroad. Although it should have been destroyed, the bridge over the Slim River survived. When the Japanese advanced 19 miles into the territory of the 11th Division, the thrust ceased. The major city, Kuala Lumpur, was lost along with central Malaya as a result of this battle's defeat. When it was decided to make a large withdrawal into Johor, Australian Maji, General Henry Gordon Bennett became more active in the conflict. This would need battling in the wide countryside, where Japanese armor would be considerably more helpful and would require giving away the provinces of Negri Sembilon, Selangor, and Malacca. Gordon Bennett had not been impressed by the British command so far, but he believed he had a fair chance of holding the Japanese. Since there were no bridges across the lower parts of the Muar River, it was decided to stand at Muar. General Archibald Wavell was named Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific on December 30th. He headed north to assess the situation after arriving in Singapore on January 7th. He quickly affirmed Percival's belief that the Australians and 45th Indian Brigade should fight the pivotal battle in northwest Johor. This was hoped to allow the 9th and 11th Divisions to rest and regroup, as well as for the 18th British Division to arrive. Even though the Australian dismissed the Indian soldiers' lack of fighting skills, Wavell was impressed with Gordon Bennett. His claim that one Australian is worth 10 Japanese was mostly empty rhetoric. Wavell, however, was fully aware of the Australian troops' spirit of combat and believed Gordon Bennett was the bold leader they required. Gordon Bennett would conduct very active defense and will hopefully be able to delay enemy until collection of reserves enables us to deliver counterstroke, which will not be before the middle of February, he told London. The 18th British Division's 53rd Brigade disembarked in Singapore on January 13th with 50 Hurricane fighters, but only 25 pilots. As the Imperial Guards gathered in Malacca, Yamashita rested his 5th Division at Seremban, 30 miles south of Kuala Lumpur. The rest of Mutaguchi's 18th Division had arrived at Singora by this point. The Japanese began attacking the Australians and Gordon Bennett's West Force on January 14th. The bridge that permitted the Japanese to cross the river at Guimas was blown away after they had done so. They encountered a field artillery battery and the 230 Australian Battalion, which decimated the Japanese. The following day's repeated onslaught was repelled, but as pressure mounted, the Australians retreated that evening. The Japanese cut the Muar-Bakri Road behind the British 45th Brigade after landing by sea behind the British position at Muar on the west coast. The Australians in the middle were in danger because the path to Yongpeng was open. The 229 Battalion was dispatched by Gordon Bennett to support Muar. Percival was certain that he now faced 5 Japanese divisions, so he threw the 53rd into the battle before it had had time to adjust, while the freshly arriving 53rd Brigade, which had been on ships for 3 months, relieved an Australian battalion on the east coast. Between Batu Pahat and Muar, more Japanese landings had place. In order for the Australians in the center to evacuate south from Segamat before becoming stuck, the British 45th Brigade was instructed to retake Muar. The brigade had to battle its way back through Japanese barricades after the counterattack quickly collapsed. Ultimately, leaving behind cars and weapons, the 45th and the 229 Australians fled into the forest. Less than 1,000 of the 4,000 men survived. The Japanese killed the injured. Nevertheless, West Force was able to flee south since their sacrifice had held back the Imperial Guards. The next line of defense ran 90 miles south, from Batu Pahat across Malaya to Kluang and Mersing on the east coast. Lieutenant General Heath assumed command of this sector, which belonged to the Threes Corps. No retreat was commanded by Percival without his consent. But the story was the same when the Japanese relocated by water. After losing half of its strength at Batu Pahat, the 615 Brigade withdrew, with 2,700 men fleeing the Japanese by sea. At Kluang, this forced West Force to retreat. A company of Japanese tanks and the equivalent of a battalion of Imperial Guards were destroyed by Muar Force in 6 days of battle that ended on January 22nd, thanks to 2 Australian battalions. At this point, General Yamashita was behind schedule. In his journal, he claimed that Matsui of the 15th Division and Nishimura, the commander of the Guards Division, had defied his instructions and postponed the advance. The Australians used the same ambush strategy in the east, close to Hersong, where they lured the Japanese into a firebox of field artillery and rifle companies, destroying a Japanese force. However, the trend of withdrawal was not reversed by such measures. Wavell gave Percival permission to leave for Singapore Island on January 30th. The 45th and 22nd Indian troops lost so many casualties during this final phase of the mainland war that they were rendered obsolete by the Japanese, who were able to elude the 9th Indian Division's withdrawing troops. When the 3 Corps reached Singapore Island, many of troops were missing. The 44th Indian Brigade brought 7,000 untrained raw men with them on January 22nd. The 2-4 Australian Machine Gun Battalion was a welcome reinforcement when 1,900 Australians arrived 2 days later in a similar condition. A week later, the 54th and 55th Brigades landed on American transport ships, and the majority of the 18th British Division arrived. Regretfully, on February 5th, the Empress of Asia was attacked and sunk, nearly within sight of Singapore, carrying 22,035 troops of the 18th British Division, including the Reconnaissance Battalion, 9th Northumberland Fusiliers, 125th Anti-Tank Regiment, and other units. Nearly all of the soldiers and a large portion of the crew were saved, but all of the equipment was destroyed. The Argylls were the final regiment to cross the causeway, with their pipers playing Heelan Laddie, although the Australians did it at daybreak on January 31st. Lieutenant Cole Ian Stewart was asked why he did that by Major John Wyatt. Stewart remarked, "You know, Wyatt, the problem with you Australians is that you don't understand history. As the final regiment to cross the causeway, piped across by their pipers, the Argylls are immortalized in the history books." Singapore's population had grown to around 1 million people. Percival had 85,000 troops to defend it, including 2 Malay, 6 Australian, 13 British, and 17 Indian battalions. However, figures are deceptive. Some troops were raw from the convoys, while many had been beaten during the mainland war. A few of them had never fired a firearm at all. Percival separated the island into 4 sectors. The Malaya Brigade and fortress troops held the city. The 3 Corps, bolstered by the 18th Division, held the northern area, which included the naval base, and the 8th Australian Division held the western area. The 12th Indian Brigade served as the reserve and occupied the water reservoirs. In order to cover every potential shore landing, Percival divided up his men, which was a surefire way to fail. He thought that east of the causeway, the Japanese would launch an attack. Holding the naval base was his top priority, but that was now all but pointless. Percival had been informed by Wavell that he believed the Japanese would launch an attack in the northwest, following the path of their main advance axis down the west coast of Malaya. Percival was the only one who could see the wisdom in moving their whole force from west to east to cross at a bigger spot. Despite the dire circumstances, many British people refused to give up. Under the command of Royal Marine Captain Bob Lang, 210 Royal Marine survivors from Prince of Wales and Repulse joined 250 members of Major Angus Rose's 2nd Argylls on January 29, 1942, to conduct operations utilizing boats to launch an attack from the sea, 140 miles behind Japanese lines. The hybrid unit, officially known as the Marine Argyll Battalion, adopted the moniker Plymouth Argylls after the English soccer team of the same name because both attachments were from the Marine Plymouth Division. They were also known as Rose Force, and they killed 2 senior Japanese staff officers in their cars, set up ambushes, and wrecked vehicles. Yamashita gave his senior commanders their attack instructions on February 6th. On February 8th, the attack on Singapore would start around 8:30 p.m. Tengah Airstrip would be the first target for the 5th and 18th Divisions when they landed on the west coast. The Imperial Guards would isolate British soldiers in the naval base after attacking the causeway area in the second phase. The reservoirs of water would come next. Yamashita estimated that the British would surrender once these were taken. The fact that his guards were demoted to the second phase infuriated Nishimura, who saw it as an insult. General Sosaku Suzuki, Yamashita's chief of staff, attempted but was unable to reconcile the 2 men. "I expect every inch of ground to be defended, and no question of surrender to be entertained until after protracted fighting among the ruins of Singapore City," Churchill warned Wavell, anticipating a street struggle. Along the Johore Strait, Japanese artillery fired 440 guns with 200 rounds per cannon on the evening of February 8th. The first contingent of 4,000 Japanese soldiers arrived on the northwest shore of Singapore at 8:45 p.m., having crossed the Johore Strait. The Imperial Guards, meantime, had been staging protests in East Johor while pretending to be under siege from the northeast. The entire front, from the Bula River to the 219 Battalion's right-hand company, was under attack during the course of the following hour. The invaders were dispersed by the Vickers machine guns, but they continued to advance, encroaching on the 219's weapon pits. The guys there were overrun after only 15 minutes of resistance. On the morning of February 9th, the Plymouth Argylls were ordered to move north up the Bukit Timah Road, and then west along the Choa Chu Kang Road toward Tengah Airfield, as the weary Australian defenders withdrew. The Royal Marines were attacked by aircraft shortly after their arrival, and some units got confused in the strange environment. Between Tenga and the dairy farm east of the Upper Bukit Timah Road, the Plymouth Argylls and the Japanese fought for 2 more days. The Japanese drove their tanks down the road and broke through 2 obstacles, cutting off the majority of the Argylls. Across the dairy farm and down the pipeline to the golf course, the main body of Royal Marines made their getaway. As soon as they reached Tyersall Park, an air assault devastated the camp and the nearby Indian Military Hospital. Men, including the wounded, were further scattered in the ensuing confusion and the shelling and mortaring. Both Japanese divisions and their artillery came ashore by the late hours of the 9th. The 22nd Australian Brigade, which took the brunt of the attack, was destroyed, but the 44th Indian Brigade managed to hold on. The 6th and 15th Brigades provided reinforcement, but the enemy's infiltration strategies caused the Australians to become dispersed. Yamashita established his headquarters in a rubber plantation north of Tenga Airfield that evening. Percival still didn't trust that there would be no attack in the northeast the following morning, so he shifted the 12th Indian Brigade to the Bukit Panjang area while leaving all the formations there unaltered. The 2nd Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, sometimes known as the Plymouth Argylls, and 400 members of the 419 Hyderabad's now made up this brigade. The Imperial Guards discovered the channel close to the causeway on the evening of February 9th. On February 11th, Keegan Setsu Day, the day the Japanese Empire was founded, the Japanese sought to seize Singapore. They had captured Bukit Timah by the 11th's morning. Percival disregarded a communication sent by air asking him to surrender in order to speed up the British surrender. By February 12th, the 5th and 18th Japanese divisions were worn out from the attack on the defenders at the city's water reservoirs. Yamashita did not like the guards and their captain, but they were now the major force. They refused to be rushed, yet he had to rely on them. Japanese forces from the north were pouring onto the island while the causeway was being repaired. While the British gunners were deadly and appeared to have an endless supply of shells, the Japanese knew their artillery ammunition was running low. Before it could begin, a fierce barrage broke up one Japanese infantry charge. There must be no thought of sparing the troops or population. Commanders and senior officers should die with their troops, Churchill insisted from London. The British armies and the British Empire's honor are on the line. The request was ignored. Yamashita received the startling news that a brigadier with a white flag had arrived on the front line as a peace envoy at 2 p.m. on February 15th. The Japanese initially believed it to be a ruse. One of Yamashita's staff officers, Major Kunitake, believed the white flag was a charade because the Japanese army was growing weary and starting to consider surrendering. Percival personally visited the Ford factory in Bukit Timah later that day to demand peace. I now realize that the British Army had about 1,000 men against my 3 divisions of 3,000 men, Yamashita wrote in his diary, describing his nervousness during that meeting. In addition, they possessed a lot more ammunition than I did, including bullets. I was worried that they would realize how much smaller our forces were than theirs. To conceal his nervousness, he spoke to Percival in a hectoring tone. When asked if Percival was going to give up, he repeatedly used the English words yes or no. The 2 generals clasped hands after Percival finally consented and signed the surrender paperwork. On February 15, 1942, British troops on the island stopped firing around 8:30 p.m. While many other units defected or attempted to get onto ships in the harbor, the Plymouth Argylls were one of the few units that fought valiantly to the very end of the Malayan campaign. The remaining Plymouth Argylls were taken into custody and worked as slaves on the notorious Burma-Thailand Death Railway for the following 31 years under the appalling circumstances of Japanese prison camps. Japanese crimes at the Alexandria Hospital on February 14th, where the workers and injured were brutally murdered, surely had an impact on Percival's choice. Known for their ruthlessness, these were the Butchers of Nanking. Humane by nature, Percival had to take into account Singapore's sizable civilian population throughout a protracted resistance. Later, On summarizing the war, Percival believed that the British lack of tanks and air superiority were the main causes of the defeat. Nonetheless, Yamashita believed that racial division among Australians, Chinese, Malays, Indians, and British was a significant issue. Wavell believed the Japanese could be fought to a halt. Therefore, it's interesting to wonder how long it would have taken the British to reverse the situation. However, Yamashita had access to resources from Manchuria and China, whereas the British had few reinforcements. Wavell might have been correct. A more assertive leader could have been successful. Later, General Stanley Kirby claimed that he believed that more men than simply Percival were responsible for the disaster. To put it succinctly, those in charge of managing the land battle in Malaya made every mistake imaginable. Heath, Wavell, Percival, and Gordon Bennett had all made grave mistakes in their assessments of the adversary and how to best defeat him. Wavell later acknowledged that he had overestimated Percival's prospects of defeating the Japanese soldier and had underestimated him from the start. Instead, the British Empire in the East was permanently destroyed when the Japanese beat the British and took roughly 100,000 troops into captivity in 70 days at a cost of 3,500 lives. In captivity, thousands of Australian, Indian, and British POWs perished.